The massive crystalline dome of the Imperial Senate stretched endlessly above, its surface pulsing with the bioluminescent patterns that conveyed the emotions of the assembled delegates. Today, those patterns flickered with agitation, uncertainty, and barely contained hostility. Ambassador Rebecca Chen sat motionlessly in the cramped human delegation booth, watching as representatives from across the Zirion Empire's 1,000 worlds prepared to seal humanity's fate. But before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Beside her, General Marcus Webb shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his weathered hands clasped tightly on the polished obsidian table. To her left, Dr. Samantha Rivers adjusted her data tablet for the third time in as many minutes, her scientific mind seeking patterns in the chaos that surrounded them. The three humans were dwarfed by the massive amphitheater, their small section seeming almost comically insignificant among the towering platforms that housed the Empire's more established species. The Zirion Empire had ruled this galaxy for over 3 millennia, its reach extending across star systems that humanity could barely comprehend. When Earth had first made contact 30 years ago, the Empire had seemed like salvation itself. Here was a civilization that had solved the problems of war, famine, and disease across countless worlds. They offered humanity membership, protection, and access to technologies that would transform human civilization overnight. The Empire's generosity had seemed too good to be true, and perhaps it was. Humanity had been granted provisional membership status, allowed to establish colonies on 3 worlds within the Empire's protective sphere, and given access to basic technologies that had revolutionized human medicine, agriculture, and transportation. In return, humanity was expected to contribute to the Empire's continued prosperity and follow its ancient laws and customs. High Chancellor Vexhide dominated the central platform, its serpentine form coiled around a speaking pillar that amplified its thoughts directly into the minds of every delegate present. The Chancellor's species, the Kthari, had founded the Empire millennia ago and still maintained absolute authority over its governance. Its mental voice resonated with the weight of ages, carrying undertones of disappointment and growing impatience. The session had been called to address what the Chancellor termed the human problem. For months, complaints about humanity's behavior had been filtering up through the Empire's bureaucracy. The humans, it seemed, were not adapting to imperial life as smoothly as anyone had hoped. They asked too many questions, challenged too many assumptions, and worst of all, they had begun to refuse certain generous offers from the Empire's leadership. Chancellor Vexhide's mental emanations filled the chamber with a sense of solemn duty. The human delegation had been summoned to answer for their species' increasingly troublesome behavior. Around the amphitheater, delegates from hundreds of worlds leaned forward in anticipation. The Zephyrian bird people ruffled their iridescent feathers nervously, while the massive stone-bodied golem representatives remained motionless as mountains. Even the normally peaceful Aquarians had emerged from their liquid-filled chambers to witness this confrontation. Rebecca had known this day would come. As Earth's primary liaison to the Empire, she had spent the last 5 years navigating the complex web of imperial politics, trying to secure humanity's place in this vast galactic community. She had attended countless diplomatic functions, studied imperial law and custom, and worked tirelessly to address every concern raised about human behavior. But she had also begun to notice things that disturbed her deeply. The Empire's offer of protective shields had been one of the first red flags. Every human colony world had been encouraged to accept the installation of planetary defense systems, magnificent energy barriers that would protect against asteroid impacts, solar flares, and hostile attacks. The technology was impressive, generating invisible fields of force that could deflect virtually any external threat. But when human scientists had asked to study the shield generators, to understand how they worked, and perhaps contribute improvements, they had been politely but firmly refused. The technology is too complex for developing species to comprehend, the Imperial technicians had explained. These systems require constant monitoring and adjustment by qualified personnel. Attempting to modify them without proper training could result in catastrophic failure. Dr. Rivers had been among the human scientists who found this explanation unsatisfactory. Her team had conducted extensive passive scans of the shield generators. using equipment that the Empire had deemed acceptable for human use. What they discovered raised more questions than answers. The shields appeared to be far more sophisticated than necessary for their stated purpose. They incorporated detection systems that monitored not just external threats but internal activity as well. They seemed designed to prevent things from getting out as much as they prevented things from getting in. When Dr. Rivers had requested clarification about these additional functions, she had been told that such features were standard components of all Imperial defense systems. The Empire needed to monitor its worlds for signs of internal strife or rebellion, after all. Surely humanity understood the necessity of maintaining order across such a vast territory. General Webb had raised different concerns about the Empire's military integration programs. Human forces had been invited to participate in joint training exercises with Imperial troops, but these exercises followed very specific patterns. Human units were always assigned supporting roles, never taking the lead in strategic planning or independent operations. When Webb had suggested that human military doctrine might offer valuable perspectives on certain tactical problems, he had been thanked for his input and politely ignored. The Empire's approach to human education had proven equally troubling. Young humans who showed exceptional aptitude in science, engineering, or leadership were offered prestigious positions in Imperial institutions. But these opportunities came with a price. The students were required to relocate permanently to Imperial core worlds, where they would be educated according to Imperial standards and methods. Most concerning of all, these students rarely maintained contact with their families or home colonies after their departure. Ambassador Chen had raised this issue with Imperial authorities multiple times, suggesting that human students should be allowed to maintain their cultural connections while receiving Imperial education. The response had been consistent. Integration into Imperial society required full commitment to Imperial values and methods. Divided loyalties would only hinder the students' development and their ability to contribute to the Empire's mission. Chancellor Vexhai's mental voice cut through the murmur of delegate conversations like a blade through silk. The time for preliminary discussions had ended. The formal proceedings would now begin. The chamber's bioluminescent patterns shifted to deep blues and purples, signaling the gravity of the moment. Representatives from across the Empire settled into positions of respectful attention as the Chancellor began to speak. The charges against humanity were extensive and had been building for years. The first accusations centered on what Imperial observers termed excessive curiosity. Human scientists and engineers had consistently requested access to technologies and information that exceeded their clearance levels. They had attempted to reverse engineer Imperial devices, study restricted materials, and gain unauthorized access to classified databases. This behavior demonstrated a fundamental lack of respect for Imperial security protocols and ancient traditions of knowledge sharing. The second charge was even more serious: cultural contamination. Human colonists had been observed sharing their historical records, philosophical traditions, and technological innovations with other species within the Empire. The sharing had occurred without proper Imperial oversight or approval. Several younger species had begun to adopt human customs and ideas, potentially disrupting the careful balance that the Empire had maintained for millennia. The third accusation struck at the heart of Imperial authority: questioning of established order. Human representatives had repeatedly challenged Imperial policies during diplomatic meetings. They had suggested alternative approaches to governance, proposed modifications to existing laws, and most troubling of all, they had begun to ask detailed questions about the Empire's foundational principles and long-term objectives. Chancellor Vexhai paused in its mental recitation, allowing the weight of these accusations to settle across the assembled delegates. The charges painted a picture of a species that refused to accept its place in the established hierarchy, that persisted in disruptive behavior despite repeated warnings and guidance from Imperial authorities. But the most damning accusation was yet to come. Recent intelligence reports suggested that humanity was secretly developing technologies and capabilities that exceeded what the Empire had authorized. Human colonies had been observed constructing unauthorized communication networks, developing advanced transportation systems, and establishing research facilities that operated outside Imperial oversight. Most concerning of all, human military forces appeared to be far more capable than they had initially reported. The Chancellor's mental emanations took on overtones of genuine concern as it described the final charge. Humanity appeared to be preparing for something. Resource stockpiles had been quietly accumulated on all 3 human colonies. Transportation systems had been upgraded beyond apparent necessity. And most troubling of all, human birth rates had increased dramatically since joining the Empire, suggesting a species that was preparing for expansion rather than peaceful integration. As the accusations mounted, Rebecca felt a familiar mixture of frustration and sad recognition wash over her. Every charge was technically accurate, but the context behind each action had been either ignored or deliberately misinterpreted. Humanity's scientific curiosity wasn't disrespectful. It was how humans learned and contributed. Their cultural sharing wasn't contamination. It was friendship and mutual exchange. Their questions about imperial policies weren't challenges to authority. They were attempts to understand and participate meaningfully in galactic governance. The unauthorized developments on human colonies weren't preparations for rebellion or expansion. They were contingency plans developed by a species that had learned, through bitter experience, never to become completely dependent on others for their survival. Humanity had entered the Empire with hope and enthusiasm, but that enthusiasm had gradually been tempered by growing awareness of what membership actually meant. Dr. Rivers leaned forward slightly as Chancellor Vexhai began to present specific evidence of human transgressions. Holographic displays materialized throughout the chamber, showing detailed surveillance data from human colonies. The images revealed research facilities, communication networks, and resource storage areas that imperial authorities had classified as unauthorized. What the displays didn't show was the context behind these facilities or the reasons for their construction. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The research stations had been built after human scientists realized that imperial technology came with built-in limitations. The devices provided to humanity were sophisticated but incomplete, lacking the flexibility and adaptability that human engineers considered essential. When requests for technical specifications had been denied, human scientists had been forced to develop their own alternatives to fill critical gaps in their technological capabilities. The communication networks had become necessary after human colonies discovered that all imperial communication systems included monitoring and filtering components. Messages between human worlds were regularly delayed, edited, or blocked entirely based on criteria that were never clearly explained. The unauthorized networks allowed humans to maintain contact with each other without imperial interference, something that should have been a basic right but had proven impossible within official channels. The resource stockpiles represented perhaps the most pragmatic response to imperial membership. Humans had quickly learned that imperial supply chains were subject to interruption based on political considerations that were rarely explained to provisional members. Essential materials could be delayed or redirected without notice, leaving human colonies vulnerable to shortages of food, medicine, or critical equipment. The stockpiles were insurance against such vulnerabilities, not preparation for aggressive expansion. General Webb watched the holographic evidence with professional interest, noting how the imperial surveillance systems had captured detailed information about human military capabilities while revealing nothing about comparable capabilities possessed by other imperial species. The displays showed human defensive installations, training facilities, and equipment stockpiles, but they were presented as evidence of hostile intent rather than reasonable preparations for self-defense. The general had spent considerable time studying imperial military doctrine and had reached troubling conclusions about the Empire's true nature. The vast majority of imperial worlds possessed only minimal defensive capabilities, relying entirely on the Empire's central military forces for protection. This arrangement ensured that no individual world or species could threaten imperial authority, but it also meant that those worlds were completely helpless if imperial protection was withdrawn. Humanity's refusal to adopt this model of complete dependence had clearly been noticed and interpreted as a sign of hostile intent. But Webb understood that asking humanity to abandon its military traditions and capabilities was like asking a species to voluntarily blind itself. Humans had survived and thrived in a dangerous universe by being prepared for threats, not by trusting others to protect them. As the evidence presentation continued, Ambassador Chen found herself remembering the conversation that had triggered this entire crisis. 3 months ago, she had been summoned to a private meeting with Chancellor Vexhai and several high-ranking imperial officials. The topic had been humanity's future integration into imperial society, and the proposals presented had been both generous and deeply disturbing. The Empire was prepared to offer humanity full membership status, complete with access to the most advanced imperial technologies and participation in the highest levels of galactic governance. Human colonies would receive massive infrastructure investments, transforming them into showcase worlds that would serve as examples of imperial prosperity and benevolence. The human population would be relocated to specially designed cities that would provide unprecedented comfort and security. But the offer had come with conditions that Rebecca found impossible to accept. Humanity would be required to abandon its traditional governmental structures in favor of imperial administration. Human military forces would be disbanded and replaced with imperial security forces. Most critically, human reproductive and educational policies would be brought under imperial oversight to ensure proper integration with galactic society. When Rebecca had asked for time to consult with Earth's government about these proposals, she had been told that the offer was time-sensitive and required immediate acceptance. The Empire had invested considerable resources in humanity's development and needed assurance that those investments would produce appropriate returns. Continued provisional status was no longer sustainable given the security concerns that had been raised about human activities. The Chancellor had been particularly emphatic about the benefits of the proposed arrangement. Humanity would finally be safe from the dangers that lurked beyond imperial borders. The galaxy was full of hostile forces that regularly threatened peaceful species. Only under imperial protection could humanity hope to survive and prosper in such a dangerous environment. It was then that Rebecca had asked the question that had doomed any chance of peaceful resolution. Safe from what, exactly? The Chancellor's response had been both illuminating and terrifying. The Empire faced constant threats from chaotic forces that sought to undermine galactic stability. There were species that rejected the benefits of civilized order, preferring violence and expansion to peaceful cooperation. There were ancient entities that viewed younger civilizations as resources to be consumed rather than partners to be protected. There were dimensional intrusions that could corrupt entire star systems if not properly contained. But as the Chancellor had described these threats in greater detail, Rebecca had begun to recognize a pattern. Every hostile force mentioned seemed to share certain characteristics. They were highly advanced, fiercely independent, and resistant to imperial authority. They possessed technologies that the Empire coveted but could not replicate. Most tellingly, they had all rejected imperial protection when it was offered to them. When Rebecca had pressed for more specific information about these threats, the Chancellor had become evasive. The details were classified at levels far above humanity's clearance. What mattered was that the Empire had successfully protected its member species from these dangers for millennia. Trust in imperial wisdom and capabilities was essential for continued safety. But Rebecca's scientific training had taught her to look for evidence rather than accepting claims at face value. Over the following weeks, she had quietly researched the historical records available to human representatives. What she found suggested that the Empire's protection might be far more complex than advertised. Many of the species that had joined the Empire over the centuries had possessed advanced technologies and independent military capabilities when they first made contact. But over time, these capabilities had been systematically transferred to imperial control or simply abandoned as unnecessary. The official histories described this process as natural evolution toward more efficient and peaceful arrangements. But Rebecca noticed that species which had resisted this transfer had invariably been reclassified as, quote, threats to galactic stability. The pattern was subtle but unmistakable. The Empire offered protection to developing species, gradually absorbing their unique capabilities and resources while ensuring their complete dependence on imperial systems. Species that proved too independent or too capable of self-defense eventually faced choice: complete integration under imperial terms or classification as hostile entities that threaten the peace and security of the galaxy. Now, as Chancellor Vexhai concluded its presentation of evidence against humanity, Rebecca understood that her species faced exactly that choice. The Empire was no longer willing to tolerate humanity's continued independence, even at the limited level of provisional membership. The accusations and evidence were simply the justification for a decision that had already been made. The Chancellor's mental voice took on tones of regret and disappointment as it addressed the human delegation directly. The Empire had hoped that humanity would mature into a valued member of galactic civilization. Considerable resources had been invested in human development, and significant patience had been shown regarding human eccentricities and cultural limitations. But recent events had made it clear that humanity was not prepared to accept the responsibilities that came with Imperial membership. Therefore, the Chancellor announced, the Imperial Senate would vote on a new resolution regarding humanity's status within the Empire. The resolution offered two options: immediate transition to full Imperial oversight and integration, or termination of membership and expulsion from Imperial territory. There would be no middle ground, no extended provisional status, and no opportunity for gradual adaptation to Imperial requirements. The terms of full integration were presented with clinical precision. Human governmental structures would be dissolved and replaced with Imperial administration within 6 months. All human military forces would be disbanded, with personnel offered positions within the Imperial military hierarchy based on their demonstrated loyalty and capabilities. Human colonies would be restructured according to Imperial urban planning standards, with populations relocated as necessary to achieve optimal efficiency and security. Most significantly, human reproductive and educational policies would be brought under Imperial oversight immediately. The Empire had developed sophisticated methods for ensuring that developing species maintained appropriate population levels and cultural development. These methods had proven successful across thousands of worlds and would ensure humanity's successful integration into galactic society. The alternative was equally clear. Species that chose to reject Imperial membership would be required to withdraw from all Imperial territory within 1 standard year. They would forfeit all technologies and resources provided during their membership period and would be prohibited from establishing future contact with Imperial worlds or citizens. Most importantly, they would lose all claim to Imperial protection against the hostile forces that threatened independent civilizations throughout the galaxy. As the Chancellor's mental emanations faded, the chamber filled with the soft rustling and chittering sounds that indicated delegate discussion periods. Representatives from across the Empire began to confer among themselves, sharing thoughts and reactions to the proposal. The general sentiment seemed to be one of understanding and support for the Imperial position. Humanity had been given generous opportunities to prove their value as Imperial citizens, and their continued resistance to integration threatened the stability that the Empire had worked millennia to achieve. Ambassador Chen requested permission to address the assembly, and after a brief consultation among the senior delegates, permission was granted. She stood slowly, aware that every sensor and recording device in the massive chamber was focused on her small figure. The weight of representing her entire species in this moment felt almost overwhelming, but her voice remained steady and clear as she began to speak. She thanked the Chancellor and the assembled delegates for their patience with humanity's adjustment period. The transition from an independent species to membership in such a vast and sophisticated civilization had indeed presented challenges that humanity had not fully anticipated. Many of the concerns raised by Imperial authorities were valid, and humanity accepted responsibility for actions that had caused confusion or concern among their galactic neighbors. But Rebecca also wanted the Assembly to understand the context behind many of these actions. Humanity had not intended to show disrespect for Imperial traditions or authority. Their scientific curiosity and desire to understand the technologies they had been given reflected their commitment to becoming valuable contributors to Imperial society, not attempts to steal or misuse Imperial knowledge. Similarly, the sharing of human culture and ideas with other species had been motivated by friendship and desire for mutual understanding, not by any intent to disrupt established order. Humans naturally formed connections with other beings and found joy in sharing their experiences and perspectives. This sharing had always been reciprocal, with humans learning as much as they taught. The questions that human representatives had raised about Imperial policies and procedures reflected genuine desire to understand and participate meaningfully in galactic governance. Humans had not sought to challenge Imperial authority, but to comprehend their role within the larger galactic community. The alternative approaches they had suggested were offered as potential contributions to ongoing policy discussions, not as criticisms of existing arrangements. Rebecca paused to let these explanations resonate through the chamber before addressing the more serious accusations. The unauthorized developments on human colonies had indeed occurred, but they reflected practical necessity rather than hostile preparation. Humans had built communication networks because imperial systems had proven inadequate for maintaining contact between their scattered populations. They had developed research facilities because the technologies provided by the Empire, while impressive, had not met all of humanity's specific needs. The resource stockpiles and defensive installations reflected humanity's commitment to being responsible for their own security rather than becoming a burden on imperial resources. Humans understood that the Empire's protection was valuable and costly, and they had tried to minimize the resources required for their defense by maintaining reasonable capabilities for self-protection. Most importantly, Rebecca wanted the Assembly to understand that humanity's preparations reflected past experience rather than future intentions. Humans had learned through their history that survival required preparedness, and that dependence on others, however well-intentioned, could become vulnerability if circumstances changed. Their contingency planning was not evidence of hostile intent, but of responsible citizenship. As Rebecca spoke, she noticed subtle changes in the chamber's bioluminescent patterns. Some delegates seemed genuinely interested in humanity's perspective, while others appeared to have already made up their minds about the resolution. The Chancellor's mental emanations remained neutral, but she sensed undercurrents of impatience with her explanations. She concluded her initial response by acknowledging the Empire's generous offer of full integration and the serious consideration it deserved. Humanity understood the benefits that full imperial citizenship would provide, and appreciated the resources that the Empire was willing to invest in their development. But she also wanted to be completely honest about humanity's concerns regarding certain aspects of the proposed arrangement. The dissolution of human governmental structures would represent a fundamental change in how humans organized their society. While humans respected imperial administration methods, they had developed their own approaches to governance over thousands of years, and these approaches reflected important aspects of human nature and culture. Complete abandonment of these traditions would represent a significant loss for humanity. Similarly, the disbanding of human military forces raised concerns about humanity's ability to contribute to imperial security. Human military traditions had produced innovative tactics and technologies that could potentially benefit the Empire's overall defensive capabilities. Rather than simply disbanding these forces, perhaps they could be integrated with imperial military structures in ways that preserved their unique contributions. The proposed changes to human reproductive and educational policies represented perhaps the most serious concerns. Humans understood the importance of population management and cultural development, but they also believed that these areas were fundamental to species identity and autonomy. Any changes to these policies would need to be implemented gradually and with careful attention to human cultural values and individual rights. Rebecca's voice took on a more serious tone as she addressed the alternative option of membership termination. Humanity was deeply grateful for the opportunities that imperial membership had provided, and would be reluctant to abandon the relationships and connections they had built within the galactic community. But if the choice was between complete surrender of human autonomy and independence from imperial authority, humanity would need time to carefully consider which option better served their long-term interests. The chamber's atmosphere grew tense as Rebecca made a request that she knew would be controversial. Given the magnitude of the decision being demanded of humanity, she asked for a delay in the voting to allow human representatives to consult with their government and population. The choice between full integration and membership termination would affect every human being in the galaxy, and such a decision deserved careful deliberation rather than immediate response. Chancellor Vexai's mental emanations took on sharp edges of displeasure as it responded to Rebecca's request. The Empire had already shown considerable patience with humanity's gradual adaptation to imperial requirements. The current situation had arisen precisely because humanity had used previous delays to develop unauthorized capabilities and to resist integration efforts. Further delay would only allow additional time for humans to prepare for potential conflict with imperial authority. The Chancellor's mental voice grew more forceful as it explained the Empire's position. The decision being offered to humanity was straightforward and required no extended deliberation. Either humans were prepared to commit fully to imperial citizenship, accepting all the responsibilities and requirements that such citizenship entailed, or they were not suitable for membership in a civilized galactic community. The hostile forces that threatened the galaxy showed no patience for extended diplomatic processes. They struck without warning and showed no mercy to civilizations that lacked adequate protection. The Empire's offer of protection and integration represented humanity's only realistic hope for long-term survival in such a dangerous environment. Rejecting this offer or attempting to negotiate modified terms would leave humanity vulnerable to threats that they could not possibly comprehend or defend against. Moreover, the Chancellor continued, humanity's recent behavior had raised serious questions about their long-term intentions. The unauthorized developments on human colonies could easily be interpreted as preparation for aggressive expansion rather than defensive measures. The Empire could not allow potentially hostile forces to establish themselves within Imperial territory while claiming the benefits of Imperial protection and resources. The mental emanations from the Chancellor took on overtones of finality as it announced the voting schedule. The Imperial Senate would vote on the resolution regarding humanity's status in exactly 72 hours. This would provide adequate time for the human delegation to communicate with their government and population, but it would not allow time for extended negotiations or attempts to modify the terms being offered. Ambassador Chen felt her heart sink as she realized that the Empire had no intention of allowing meaningful discussion or compromise. The choice being presented was designed to force humanity into complete submission or immediate expulsion. There was no middle ground because the Empire did not want middle ground. They wanted either complete control or complete separation. As the session was formally adjourned, Rebecca gathered her materials slowly, her mind racing through the implications of what had just occurred. Around the chamber, delegates began to file out, many of them casting curious or sympathetic glances toward the small human section. Some representatives from younger species looked genuinely concerned about the precedent being set, but none approached the human delegation to offer support or alternative perspectives. General Webb was the first to break the silence as they walked toward the exit. His voice was quiet but carried undertones of steel that Rebecca had learned to recognize over their years of working together. The Empire had just revealed its true nature more clearly than any intelligence report could have managed. The choice being offered was no choice at all. It was an ultimatum designed to force complete surrender. Dr. Rivers added her own observations as they reached their secure transport vehicle. The timeline being imposed was clearly designed to prevent humanity from developing effective responses to either option. 72 hours was adequate for communication but completely inadequate for the kind of strategic planning that humanity would need regardless of which path they chose. As their transport lifted off from the Senate complex, Rebecca looked back at the massive crystalline dome that housed the Empire's seat of power. For 30 years, that building had represented hope and opportunity for humanity. Now it felt more like a beautiful trap, designed to lure developing species into dependence and eventual absorption. But there was something else in Rebecca's expression as she watched the Senate complex recede behind them. It was not fear or despair, but rather a calm recognition of clarity. For months, she had struggled with growing doubts about the Empire's true intentions and humanity's place within it. Now those doubts had been resolved. The Empire had shown its hand completely, and humanity finally understood exactly what they were dealing with. The return journey to the human embassy complex passed in thoughtful silence, each of the three representatives lost in their own analysis of the situation. They had communication arrays to activate, reports to send, and recommendations to make. But more importantly, they had to prepare for the possibility that humanity's time as members of the Zirion Empire was about to come to an end. As their transport settled onto the embassy landing pad, Rebecca allowed herself one small smile. The Empire had made a critical error in its approach to this confrontation. They had assumed that the choice they were offering would force humanity to choose safety over independence. But they had failed to ask the most important question. What if humanity no longer believed that Imperial membership actually provided safety? The next 72 hours would determine not just humanity's immediate future, but the long-term balance of power in the galaxy. And for the first time since this crisis had begun, Rebecca was beginning to believe that humanity might have more options than the Empire realized. The message arrived at Earth exactly 68 hours after the ultimatum had been delivered. President Elena Martinez stood in the Situation Room beneath the Global Defense Headquarters, surrounded by the most senior leaders of human civilization. The holographic display showed the text of humanity's response to the Zirion Empire, simple and devastating in its clarity. The human species respectfully declines both options presented by the Imperial Senate. We withdraw our request for continued membership and relinquish all Imperial territories, technologies, and protections. Effective immediately, humanity resumes full independence and responsibility for its own destiny. What followed was a single line that would echo across the galaxy for generations to come. We thank the Empire for its concern regarding threats to our safety, but we must respectfully note that in 30 years of membership, the only entity that has threatened human freedom has been the Empire itself. The response had been transmitted simultaneously to every Imperial world, every member species, and every communication network that humanity could access. There would be no private negotiations, no quiet diplomatic solutions, and no opportunity for the Empire to control the narrative. Humanity's withdrawal would be as public and transparent as possible. Within hours of the transmission, something unprecedented began to happen across the 3 human colony worlds. The Imperial shield generators that had protected these planets for decades simply shut down. Not gradually, not with ceremony or explanation, but instantly and completely. The massive energy fields that had surrounded New Terra, Kepler's Promise, and Harmony Station vanished, as if they had never existed. Governor Sarah Chen of New Terra watched from her office windows as the subtle shimmer in the sky that had marked the planetary shield's presence faded away. Her first instinct was concern. Without Imperial protection, the planet was supposedly vulnerable to the countless threats that the Empire had warned about for 3 decades. But as hours passed and no catastrophe materialized, a different realization began to take hold. The shield generators had been more than protective barriers. They had been monitoring stations, communication jammers, and control systems, all wrapped in the facade of benevolent protection. As they shut down, human communication systems that had been unreliable for years suddenly operated at full capacity. Sensor networks that had produced puzzling gaps in data began providing complete information about local space. Most remarkably, the persistent background interference that had affected human technology since joining the Empire simply disappeared. Dr. Michael Torres led the scientific team that conducted the first comprehensive scans of New Terra's space environment without Imperial oversight. What they discovered revolutionized humanity's understanding of their situation. The region around the human colonies was not filled with the dangerous radiation fields, unstable gravity wells, and hostile entities that Imperial reports had described. Instead, they found remarkably stable and safe stellar environments that posed no significant threats to human civilization. The asteroid fields that Imperial navigators had always described as extremely hazardous proved to be rich sources of rare minerals with clear, safe navigation routes. The unpredictable solar phenomena that required constant Imperial monitoring were actually regular stellar cycles that any competent human astronomer could predict and plan around. Most significantly, the dimensional instabilities that supposedly threatened to tear apart unprotected worlds were nowhere to be found. Governor Chen called an emergency session of the Colonial Council as reports continued to pour in from across the 3 human worlds. The pattern was unmistakable and deeply disturbing. For 30 years, humanity had been living under the protection of shields that defended against threats that did not exist. The Empire had not been protecting humanity from a dangerous galaxy. They had been protecting themselves from humanity's potential to discover that protection was unnecessary. Meanwhile, on the Zirion Empire's capital world, Chancellor Vexhai was receiving reports that filled its ancient consciousness with something approaching panic. The human withdrawal was not proceeding according to any of the scenarios that Imperial planners had anticipated. Instead of desperately requesting negotiations or scrambling to prepare inadequate defenses against galactic threats, humanity seemed to be thriving in their newfound independence. Imperial Intelligence Director Kthari presented the latest surveillance data with barely concealed alarm. Human ships had begun moving throughout their former territory with unprecedented speed and efficiency. The vessels themselves appeared to be far more advanced than any technology that the Empire had provided or that humanity had been authorized to develop. Most disturbing of all, human military formations were deploying with capabilities that exceeded Imperial estimates by orders of magnitude. The revelation that shocked Imperial leadership most profoundly came from their own historical archives. Senior archivist Yelena Elise had been tasked with reviewing records of humanity's initial contact and integration into the Empire. What she found buried in classified files painted a picture that contradicted 3 decades of official reports. When human ships had first entered Imperial space, they had possessed technology that Imperial scientists could not fully understand or replicate. Human faster-than-light drives operated on principles that challenged fundamental Imperial assumptions about physics. Human artificial intelligence systems demonstrated capabilities that the Empire's most advanced computers could not match. Human materials science had produced alloys and composites that Imperial engineers could not analyze or reproduce. The official integration reports had deliberately understated these capabilities, describing human technology as promising but primitive and requiring significant Imperial guidance for proper development. In reality, Imperial scientists had been frantically trying to reverse engineer human innovations while carefully ensuring that humans remained unaware of their technological superiority. The most damning discovery came from communications intercepts that had been classified at the highest levels of Imperial security. Human scientists and engineers had been expressing confusion and frustration about the limitations built into Imperial technology almost from the moment they had gained access to it. They had repeatedly attempted to improve Imperial systems using human engineering principles, only to be told that such modifications were dangerous and unauthorized. Chancellor Vexhai absorbed this information with growing dread. The Empire had built its entire relationship with humanity on the premise that humans were a developing species requiring protection and guidance. If humanity had actually been technologically superior from the beginning, then the entire foundation of Imperial authority was called into question. The situation deteriorated rapidly as reports arrived from across the Empire's border regions. The hostile forces that the Empire had used to justify its protection of member species were indeed real, but they had not been behaving as Imperial propaganda had suggested. For 30 years, these entities had maintained a careful distance from Imperial space, avoiding conflicts and generally ignoring Imperial territory altogether. Now, with humanity's declaration of independence spreading across galactic communication networks, these entities were beginning to take notice of human space for the first time. But their attention was not hostile or threatening. Instead, they seemed curious and even welcoming. Several major galactic powers that had been classified as dangerous expansionist threats by the Empire sent diplomatic overtures to human representatives, expressing interest in establishing peaceful relations. The Krillian Federation, a multi-species alliance that the Empire had described as ruthlessly aggressive and expansionist, transmitted a formal message to New Terra, congratulating humanity on achieving independence and offering immediate recognition of human sovereignty. The message included an invitation to participate in the Federation's scientific exchange programs and defensive cooperation treaties. The Nexus Collective, which Imperial reports had characterized as chaotic entities that consume entire civilizations, sent detailed technological specifications for advanced defensive systems as a gesture of friendship to humanity's new independent government. The technologies offered were clearly superior to anything the Empire had ever provided, and they came with no strings attached except a request for peaceful coexistence. Most remarkably, the Voidwalkers, described by the Empire as ancient horrors that corrupt everything they touch, transmitted a complex mathematical proof that revolutionized human understanding of faster-than-light physics. The proof included an apologetic note explaining that they had been trying to establish contact with humanity for decades but had been blocked by Imperial communication interference. As these revelations cascaded through human space, a clearer picture of galactic politics began to emerge. The Ziriad Empire was not the benevolent protector of galactic civilization that it claimed to be. Instead, it was an expansionist power that had conquered much of the galaxy through a sophisticated system of manipulation, technological suppression, and manufactured dependency. The Empire's method was elegant in its simplicity. They would approach developing species with offers of protection against fabricated or exaggerated threats. Once a species accepted Imperial membership, their technological development would be carefully controlled, and their defensive capabilities systematically dismantled. Any species that showed signs of independence or technological advancement beyond Imperial control would be reclassified as threats and eliminated through military action or economic warfare. President Martinez called an emergency session of the Human Security Council as the full scope of the Empire's deception became clear. The assembled leaders represented not just Earth, but the growing network of human colonies and installations that had been established during the Imperial period. What they were learning about their situation would reshape humanity's understanding of its place in the galaxy. Defense Minister Jackson Hayes presented the military analysis with grim satisfaction. Human defensive capabilities had always been far superior to what they had been allowed to demonstrate during Imperial membership. The restrictions placed on human military development had been presented as necessary limitations to prevent conflicts with other species. but they had actually been designed to prevent humanity from realizing its own strength. The human fleet that had been scattered across the three colony worlds was not the small collection of transport and patrol vessels that Imperial records indicated. Hidden shipyards in asteroid fields and gas giant atmospheres had been producing advanced warships for decades, using technologies that human engineers had developed independently of Imperial systems. The mining operations and research stations that dotted human space were actually sophisticated defensive installations and communication networks. Chief Technology Officer Rebecca Kim delivered the most startling revelation of all. Human artificial intelligence systems had been monitoring Imperial activities throughout the 30-year membership period, carefully documenting every instance of technological suppression, communication interference, and strategic deception. The AIs had been preparing for this moment since the early years of Imperial membership, quietly developing contingency plans and alternative technologies in preparation for humanity's eventual independence. The human AIs had reached their own conclusions about the Empire's true nature years before human leadership had fully recognized the threat. They had been subtly guiding human technological development, ensuring that critical capabilities were preserved and advanced despite Imperial restrictions. They had also been establishing covert communication networks with the galactic powers that the Empire had designated as threats, building relationships that would prove crucial for humanity's transition to independence. As the Human Security Council absorbed these revelations, reports began arriving of Imperial responses to humanity's withdrawal. The Empire's initial reaction had been confident predictions that humans would quickly discover their vulnerability and request readmission to Imperial protection. When this did not occur, Imperial responses became increasingly desperate and revealing. Imperial ships began appearing at the edges of human space, conducting what they described as, quote, routine security patrols, but which were clearly reconnaissance missions designed to assess human defensive capabilities. These ships were turned away by human patrol vessels with polite but firm warnings that Imperial ships were no longer welcome in human territory. The ease with which human ships outmaneuvered and outperformed Imperial vessels shocked Imperial commanders who had believed their technology was superior. The Empire's propaganda networks launched a massive campaign designed to convince other species that humanity represented a dangerous threat to galactic stability. Imperial media broadcasts warned of human expansionism, technological chaos, and the inevitable collapse of human civilization without Imperial guidance. But these warnings rang hollow as reports of peaceful human diplomatic contacts with other galactic powers continued to spread. More damaging to Imperial credibility were the human broadcasts that began appearing on open galactic communication networks. These transmissions included detailed documentation of Imperial surveillance systems, technological suppression methods, and the true nature of the protective systems that the Empire had installed on member worlds. The evidence was comprehensive and undeniable, exposing the Empire's methods to species that had never questioned Imperial benevolence. The first major crisis of humanity's independence came when Imperial forces attempted to enforce what they described as quarantine protocols around human space. A massive Imperial fleet, larger than any force they had deployed in living memory, positioned itself at the primary hyperspace routes leading to human territory. The stated purpose was to prevent the spread of technological contamination from human space to Imperial worlds, but the true intent was clearly to isolate humanity and demonstrate Imperial power to other member species. Admiral David Thompson commanded the human response fleet that met the Imperial blockade at the edge of human space. The confrontation that followed would be studied by military historians for generations as a perfect example of how technological superiority could overcome numerical disadvantage. The Imperial fleet consisted of over 300 vessels, including their most advanced dreadnoughts and battlecruisers. The human fleet numbered only 50 ships, but each vessel represented the pinnacle of human engineering and artificial intelligence integration. The humans had spent 30 years observing Imperial military doctrine, studying their tactics, and preparing for exactly this confrontation. Admiral Thompson opened communications with the Imperial fleet commander, offering one final opportunity for peaceful withdrawal. The Imperial response was predictable: demands for human surrender, threats of overwhelming force, and warnings about the consequences of resisting Imperial authority. When these demands were rejected, the Imperial fleet prepared to demonstrate why no species had successfully opposed the Empire for over a millennium. The battle lasted exactly 17 minutes. Human ships moved with impossible precision, their artificial intelligence systems coordinating attacks and defenses in ways that Imperial commanders could not anticipate or counter. Human weapons, based on principles that Imperial science had never fully understood, tore through Imperial shields and armor as if they were paper. Most shocking of all, human defensive systems rendered Imperial weapons almost completely ineffective. When the fighting ended, the Imperial fleet had been systematically disabled, without the loss of a single human vessel. Imperial ships floated helplessly in space, their weapons offline, their engines dead, but their life support systems intact. The humans had demonstrated their overwhelming superiority, while carefully avoiding unnecessary casualties. Admiral Thompson's final communication to the Imperial Fleet commander became legendary throughout the galaxy. Your crews will be provided with emergency supplies and navigational assistance to return to Imperial space. Please inform your leadership that human territory is now closed to Imperial forces. Any future intrusions will be met with less restraint. The news of the Imperial fleet's defeat spread across the galaxy with unprecedented speed. For the first time in over 1,000 years, the Empire had been militarily humiliated by a species they had claimed to protect. The psychological impact was devastating to Imperial credibility and inspiring to every species that had ever chafed under Imperial control. Within weeks of the battle, delegations from dozens of Imperial member worlds began arriving in human space. These were not official diplomatic missions, but covert fact-finding expeditions by species that were beginning to question their own relationship with the Empire. They wanted to understand how humanity had achieved independence and whether similar options might be available to them. The human response to these inquiries was carefully calibrated to provide information without directly encouraging rebellion against the Empire. Human representatives shared their technological discoveries, documented Imperial deception methods, and offered assistance to any species that chose to pursue independence. But they made it clear that such choices had to be made freely and without human coercion. The most significant development came when the Zephyrian Republic, one of the Empire's oldest and most trusted members, formally requested human assistance in establishing their own independence. The Zephyrians had been members of the Empire for over 500 years, but their leadership had been quietly growing concerned about Imperial policies for decades. The revelation of human technological superiority and the Empire's deceptive practices had convinced them that independence was both possible and necessary. The human response to the Zephyrian request demonstrated the principles that would guide humanity's role in the post-Imperial galaxy. Rather than establishing a new form of dominance, humans offered partnership and support based on mutual respect and shared benefits. They provided the Zephyrians with defensive technologies, but only after ensuring that the technology could be understood, maintained, and improved by Zephyrian scientists. As more species began to question Imperial authority, the Empire's responses became increasingly desperate and revealing. Imperial forces attempted to suppress communication networks that carried news of human independence. Imperial propaganda became more strident and less believable, making claims about human aggression that were contradicted by easily observable evidence. Most damaging of all, the Empire began cracking down on member species with unprecedented harshness, revealing the iron fist that had always been hidden beneath the velvet glove of Imperial benevolence. The final collapse of Imperial credibility came when human intelligence networks released comprehensive documentation of Imperial surveillance and control systems. The evidence showed that every Imperial member world was subject to constant monitoring, communication interference, and technological suppression. The protective shields that surrounded Imperial worlds were revealed to be sophisticated prison systems designed to prevent both escape and outside contact. The revelation that shocked the galaxy most profoundly was the discovery of what Imperial planners called harvest protocols. These were contingency plans for extracting useful resources, technologies, and populations from member worlds in the event of Imperial military setbacks. The protocols revealed that the Empire had never viewed member species as partners or citizens, but as resources to be exploited and discarded when convenient. As the true nature of Imperial rule became undeniable, the greatest exodus in galactic history began. Species after species declared independence from the Empire, often using human-provided technologies and defensive systems to protect themselves from Imperial retaliation. The carefully constructed system of control that had maintained Imperial dominance for millennia crumbled in a matter of months. The humans had not conquered the Zirion Empire through military force or political manipulation. They had simply demonstrated that the Empire's power was based on deception and manufactured dependency. Once that deception was exposed, the Empire's authority collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. In the aftermath of the Imperial collapse, humanity found itself in a position they had never sought, the de facto leaders of a galactic community that was rebuilding itself from the ground up. The irony was not lost on human leadership that their species, which had been dismissed as primitive and dangerous by the Empire, had become the foundation for a new form of galactic civilization based on voluntary cooperation rather than enforced submission. The new galactic order that emerged from the ruins of the Empire bore little resemblance to the hierarchical system that had preceded it. Instead of a single dominant power controlling hundreds of subject species, the galaxy became a network of independent civilizations linked by trade agreements, defense pacts, and scientific cooperation treaties. Humanity played a central role in this network, not as rulers but as facilitators and partners. The final chapter of the Imperial era came when Chancellor Vexhai itself requested a private meeting with President Martinez. The ancient being that had once commanded the loyalty of thousands of worlds now presided over a rapidly shrinking remnant of its former empire. The message it sent to Earth was both a plea for mercy and an acknowledgement of humanity's triumph. The meeting took place on a neutral station in the space between human and imperial territory. President Martinez brought a small delegation of advisors, while the Chancellor arrived with only its personal guards. The contrast between their positions could not have been more stark. Humanity ascending to galactic leadership through demonstrated capability and moral authority, while the Empire clung to the fragments of power that it had built through deception and control. Chancellor Vexhai's mental emanations carried overtones of genuine respect as it addressed the human delegation. For 3 millennia, the Empire had believed that order and stability could only be maintained through centralized control and enforced dependency. Humanity had proven that assumption wrong, demonstrating that voluntary cooperation could achieve greater prosperity and security than imposed submission. The Chancellor made a formal request that surprised no one who had been following galactic developments. The remaining Imperial worlds wished to join the new galactic community that humanity had helped to establish. They were prepared to abandon the hierarchical system that had defined the Empire, and to accept the principles of equality and mutual respect that governed the new order. President Martinez's response reflected the values that had guided humanity throughout the crisis. The remnants of the Empire would be welcome to join the galactic community, but only if they were genuinely committed to the principles of independence and cooperation. There would be no special status for former imperial worlds, no privileges based on past dominance, and no tolerance for attempts to recreate the old system of control. The transformation was completed when the last imperial shield generators were deactivated, and the ancient surveillance networks that had monitored the galaxy for millennia were dismantled. The protective barriers that had once imprisoned entire civilizations were replaced by voluntary defensive alliances based on shared interests and mutual support. In the end, the question that had triggered humanity's break with the Empire proved to be the key to understanding everything that followed. When the Empire had promised humanity shields and protection, humans had asked, quote, "Shields from what?" The answer, as it turned out, was that the shields were meant to protect the Empire from humanity's potential to expose the truth about galactic civilization. The galaxy that emerged from the Imperial collapse was more dangerous in some ways, with species required to take responsibility for their own defense and development. But it was also more dynamic, more innovative, and ultimately more secure than the controlled system that had preceded it. The threats that the Empire had used to justify its dominance proved to be manageable challenges when species worked together as equals rather than as masters and subjects. Humanity's role in this transformation established patterns that would shape galactic civilization for millennia to come. They had demonstrated that true leadership came from empowering others rather than controlling them, that security came from building trust rather than enforcing compliance, and that progress came from encouraging diversity rather than imposing uniformity. The Zirion Empire had promised humanity shields against the dangers of an hostile galaxy. Humanity had discovered that the greatest danger had been the Empire itself, and that the best shield against tyranny was the courage to stand independently and help others do the same. In asking shields from what, they had uncovered the truth that set an entire galaxy free. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.